Act 4, Scene 2 takes place at 5, Macduff's castle, and it should be remembered that this scene is a representative of the villainy of Macbeth. Along with that, it is also a representative of the violence which is represented on stage and the extremely surprised and shocked response of the audience on seeing such violence depicted on stage in Elizabethan theatre. Mostly, it should be noted that during the Elizabethan age, violence was not usually represented on stage. It was reported, for example, in Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy, the killing of Hieronymo, towards the end of the play, the killing of all the major characters in the play are not shown on stage, but the Spanish Tragedy is also one of the first pioneers in bringing violence on stage, because the characters at the end of the play, even though the violence is not exactly depicted, it's told that one of the tongue of one of the characters, namely Hieronymo, is cut off. So we get an inkling from The Spanish Tragedy by Thomas Kyd that violence could be depicted on stage, and it could have an extremely negative and a shocking response on the audience, which is required to highlight two things. One, the cruelty of the person who is perpetrating the crime, and secondly, the position of victimhood on those people on whom the crime is perpetrated. In this scene, the perpetrator of the crime is Macbeth, and therefore the violence that we see highlights the villainy of Macbeth all the more. And secondly, the victim here is the family of Macduff, namely his wife and son. Therefore, their victimhood is highlighted. To begin then, at 5, Macduff's castle, Macduff has already run away, so there is no one else left but his family. And if we remember Act 4, Scene 1, it will be noted that Macbeth had decided that even though Macduff cannot be found, then his family members should be taken revenge upon. So this scene is also important with regard to the revenge motive in the Shakespearean play. Again, a very clear relation or the clear indication of the influence that Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy, also a revenge play, has on Shakespeare's Macbeth. So Kyd would be one of the important Shakespearean predecessor in this regard. Lady Macduff says, "What has he done to make him fly the land? Ross, you must have patience, madam." Lady Macduff, "He has gone. His flight was madness when our actions do not. Our fears do make us traitors." Here, of course, Lady Macbeth is talking about the fact that since Macduff has fled Scotland, it only indicates that he has committed something treacherous, something traitorous, something wrong, when actually he hasn't. But the point is that this line, that our fears do make us traitors, is something which Lady Macbeth and Macbeth had also talked about in earlier scenes. And it is this fear which Lady Macduff here clearly expresses, and it is this kind of fear which Lady Macbeth very clearly hides. So in that regard, we understand the tragic personality of Lady Macbeth and the lack of a tragic personality of Lady Macduff. It's important that in a tragedy, we only understand the tragic stature of a character with reference, when we consider that character with reference to other characters. If someone is committing something extreme, we know that that action is extreme because someone else does not commit that extreme action. So extremity is something which is relative, and therefore it is this relative extremity between Lady Macbeth and Lady Macduff which establishes the tragic persona of the former and the lack of it in the latter. And then another very important line: all is the fear and nothing is the love, and little is the wisdom where the flight so runs against all reason. Here Lady Macduff also invokes the image of reason and the image of fear and love. This image of fear and love again is important with regard to statesmanship. If we remember about another philosophical influence on Shakespeare, that is Machiavelli, and a medieval theoretician who had written a book called The Prince in Italian, which was about the prince and the ruler and statesmanship in the medieval world. There he had talked about that a ruler should be feared and not loved if he is to rule stably. Therefore, Lady Macduff is here saying that the condition of Scotland right now is one where the ruler is only feared and not loved, and therefore we can understand, if we are calling Macbeth a tyrant, this is one of the clear philosophical grounds on which this statement can be made. And for students who are attempting the term paper on regicide, it's important that when you all are considering the figure of the king, the figure of the philosophical premises of kingship, one of the figures and one of the philosophers that you'll need to consider is the philosopher Machiavelli, and how he deals with the figure of the king or the prince or the ruler. And then when Ross goes away, exits, Lady Macduff has a short interaction with her son, and Lady Macduff says, "Sirrah, your father's dead, and what will you do now? How will you live? Son, as birds do, mother. What with worms and flies? Son, with what I get, I mean." And so do they. Here, of course, this very young child is talking about practical living and practical ethics, something which really, if Lady Macduff is talking about a madness, this statement by the young child establishes what is normalcy, what is balance, what is non-madness. And in this play we get so much of a warped thinking, or a very distorted thinking. Warped spelling is W-A-R-P-E-D, or distorted thinking, that it's very important for Shakespeare to once in a while make us remember what normal or normative thinking is. And it's based on practical ethics, it's based on moral survival rule. And then a very important discussion as to who is a traitor. It must be remembered that in Elizabethan England, the reign of Queen Elizabeth herself, which began the Elizabethan era, was itself a retaliation or a rebellion against her own Catholic sister, Mary. And therefore there were numerous in England, in Elizabethan England, who were Catholics and who really were all brutally murdered during Queen Elizabeth's rule, that is under her Protestant rule, because these people were Catholics. And then during the reign of King James I, when this play is being written, before whom this play is being staged, again a series of Catholics and Protestants are murdered. The point that I am making is that it's very difficult to identify and indicate who is a traitor and who is not. For the Catholics, for believers in Catholicism, to be a Catholic is the most sacred of sins. But if you are a Protestant living in a Catholic era, or if you are a Catholic living in a Protestant time, then you are a traitor. So the position of a traitor is very relative, is very tenuous, and therefore very difficult to really identify one's or relate one's identity to one's position. And therefore the answer that Lady Macduff gives to defining who is a traitor is something which is related very closely to what is told about Macbeth in this play. When the son asks what is a traitor, Lady Macduff says, why, one that swears and lies. Swears meaning swears that he'll speak the truth and then lies, which is the thing which is the thing called equivocation. You are saying one thing and you are swearing that it is correct, and then of course it turns out to be a lie because it's incorrect, or it's correct on some level and incorrect at the other. Another point, and an equivocation we have learned in the previous scenes has been closely associated with the witches as well as Macbeth. The other thing which takes off from this point and which is related to Macbeth is that of the difference between appearance and reality. Macbeth learns after murdering Duncan to pretend. He learns the art of pretense. He says something and means something entirely different before, of course, he turns into a villain. This would be sections of Macbeth's speeches. If you all wish to cross-refer, just go back to the end of Act 1, beginning of Act 2. During those sections, we'll find that Macbeth is really learning the art of pretense, and therefore he says something and he means something entirely different. But of course, once he turns completely into a villain, there is nothing of swearing and lying. You are out and out saying that I will commit something which is wrong. And the turning point between the two is when Macbeth makes that river of blood speech, that I have gone so far into that river of blood, meaning that I've committed so many crimes that to really correct them would be to commit a few more crimes, and therefore he wouldn't do it. It really wouldn't be possible on his part to do it. And therefore from then point onwards, this speech which I'm referring to here is in Act 3, Scene 4. After this, of course, Macbeth turns into hardcore villainy, and he therefore stops all his thinking. So the way in which Lady Macduff invokes these lines is really to make us remember, in the midst of a scene which is really highlighting Macbeth's villainy, that what kind of a traitor Macbeth is, and really what are the transitions which has gone in his character. Very important for the audience to remember that even though they are seeing before them just a villain, they really are seeing a person who he really didn't start off as a villain, but he has turned into one. So it's important in that regard. And the son, of course, adds, and they continue, and must they all be hanged that swear and lie? Lady Macduff, everyone, and who must hang them? Why, the honest men? Then the liars and the swearers are fool, for there are liars and swearers, to beat the honest men and hang them up. Of course, what the son says, but just before this I had used the word practical ethics with the son, meaning that it's ethics, it's morality, but of course it's practical, and therefore the son states something which is really practical, which is what actually happens in the world. That is not always honest men who can punish the evildoers. It's really the evildoers who can hang the honest men up. So good is not something which is always rewarded, and evil is not something which is always punished. It can really happen vice versa, and mostly in the world it turns out to be so. And then of course the messenger enters, and I am not known to you, though in your state of honor I am perfect. I doubt some danger does approach you nearly, and therefore tells her to run away with her son. And Lady Macduff, the morally neutral character that she is, the morally strong character that she is, states that whither should I fly? I have done no harm, but I remember now I am in this earthly world where to do harm is often laudable, to do good sometimes accounted dangerous folly. These two lines very important because it really states the kind of an upturned nature which Scotland presently has. Here, to do good is to bring in harm upon yourself, and to do folly and to do something incorrect is really laudable, is something which is praised. And then of course, after a depiction or a representation of the upturned universe, there is the entry of the murderers. And there is also a reference to Macduff as the traitor. It's important that the lines before this, when the word traitor was being described, we could all associate it with Macbeth. But here, of course, the murderer states that it is Macduff who is a traitor. So we can understand that how that term can be used by different people for different people without really understanding the basis of the actions, because each person uses it according to his own from his own position to explain really his own stance. So if you are calling someone a traitor, it is really your stance which is being described or represented, rather than the traitorous nature of the person whom you are calling the traitor. And finally, this last stage direction about stabbing him, really this point is what I was talking about at the beginning of the play, the representation of violence and bloodshed on stage, a stabbing of a young child, almost a helpless female and a young child, really highlights, and this is the high point of Macbeth's villainy, all the more highlighted because the victims are really poor and helpless. Act 4, Scene 3 is the final scene for this act, where we see an important conflict between the two important adversaries of Macbeth, namely Malcolm and Macduff. It is important for the presentation of the Shakespearean tragic personality that the foil characters, or characters who stand in opposition to the main character, are represented, because it is through their qualities that we will understand the difference between Macbeth and their ideals. In this scene, however, what Shakespeare does is represent to us a conflict between the two foils. Of course, one is pretending that he is something or someone unlike his real nature, namely Macduff, and the other, Malcolm, that is son of the murdered King Duncan, is testing the loyalty of a courtier in his former father's kingdom. This conversation between Malcolm and Macduff only establishes, other than the point about the foil characterization, establishes important ideas or important themes that Shakespeare was dealing with when he was representing to us the idea of kingship. Because in this play, kingship or ruling is not just an action of Duncan or Macbeth or finally Malcolm, but it's also a consistent theme. Therefore, to begin, Malcolm, let us seek out some desolate shade, and there weep our sad bosoms empty. Macduff, it should be remembered, had fled from Scotland. He had gone to England, where Malcolm had already arrived much earlier, to seek help from the English king, that is Seward, about whom we had discussed in the very first of the presentations. Macduff is saying, "Let us rather hold fast a mortal sword, and take good men bestride our downfallen birthdom. Each new morn, new widow's howl." Here he is basically describing what is the present condition of Macduff to Malcolm. The description of the women newly becoming widows, that is their husbands being murdered, children newly becoming orphans, that is their fathers being killed. Very important, these two references, because it is his wife who has newly turned into a widow, who has been killed, so he has become a widower, and his son has been murdered, so he's really the father of a child who has died. A very ironic references to himself, except that Macduff right now doesn't know that his wife and his son has been murdered. But the way in which he describes the condition of Scotland like a dolorous or or a place which is extremely sad, full of lament, grief, is basically to say in what a dire strait or in what a difficult situation presently Scotland is. This description only it not only describes the present condition of Scotland to Malcolm, who hasn't been there for quite a long time, but it's also to really call upon Malcolm to return to Scotland, claim his throne, a throne which is rightfully his because it has been bequeathed to him or given to him by his father. It's through an act of legal succession. So it's really a way to call upon Malcolm to go back to his position, and that's the intention of the speech. But of course the way Malcolm responds, very important. What I believe I'll wail, what no believe, and what I can redress, as I shall find the time to friend I will. So Malcolm is saying that I will believe whatever comes to me in time, so I will test things before I begin believing them. I will give things a bit of time before I start acting upon them. And then this tyrant whose sole name blisters our tongues was one thought honest. You have loved him well, he hath not touched you yet. A little cause for Malcolm's suspicion, except that here Malcolm is not really fully suspicious about Macduff, but really has a little bit of suspicion, and he really states that the reason here that Macduff at one point of time was extremely close to the present king, that is Macbeth, and he had considered Macbeth to be honest, and really Macduff himself hasn't been murdered yet. So really Malcolm feels at least a little bit of doubt that Macduff may have come to him only as a spy for King Macbeth and only to harm him. And Macduff very clearly states, I am not treacherous. But Macbeth is. A good and virtuous nature may recoil in an imperial charge. The phrase imperial charge, very important, that is kingly duty. And Malcolm here importantly associates this game of appearance and reality with the position of the king. If a man is working towards normal ambitions, he really doesn't, a good man, a virtuous man really doesn't turn into a treacherous person. But if that man fulfills or wants to fulfill the duties of a king, if he's not a common man but he's a king, then it's so easy to transform from a good and virtuous person to someone treacherous. Very important here, because Shakespeare is presenting to us one of the primary premises or characteristic features of a tragic persona, that is the tragic stature, the position of a king. As a common man, the tragic character is just a normal human being, but given his position, given the demands that his position makes on him, of course he transforms into something entirely different. This transformation of human nature to some extent is associated with the tragic stature or the tragic position, and therefore not every common man can be named a tragic character. And here Macbeth is compared to really the brightest star who has really fallen and has brought darkness all around. And Macduff says that I've lost all my hopes. So he says that at one point of time he did believe that Macbeth was good, that he would rule the kingdom very stably, but of course that has really fallen false. I pray you, let not my jealousies be your dishonors, but mine own safeties. You may be rightly just, whatever I shall think. Very important here that Malcolm from this position begins his game of appearance and reality. He really soothes Macduff, saying that you really should not feel that I am jealous of Macbeth, and therefore I am saying all this to break your belief in Macbeth. Whatever you feel may be all correct, which is really Malcolm's way of telling Macduff that you really should not feel that I am anti-Macbeth, that I am against the king, and so that he's doing this so that so that Macduff may open up before him. Macduff, bleed, bleed, poor country, great tyranny. And here from the rich east I would not be the villain that thou thinkest for the whole space. And here, of course, Macduff, the practical and the intelligent man that he is, understands that Malcolm is really playing a game of pretense, and therefore he states quite clearly that I really am not a villain that you are thinking me, that you consider me to be. And Malcolm says, be not offended, I speak not in absolute fear of you. I think our country sinks beneath the yoke, it weeps, it bleeds, and each day a new gash is added to her wounds. Very important here, the imagery of disease here. And here, of course, the kingdom is considered as a body politic, B-O-D-Y, body, politic is P-O-L-I-T-I-C, where it's basically the whole kingdom is being compared to the body of a man, and the condition of the present kingdom really as a result of a number of diseases compared to a man's body, which has become so ill because it's being afflicted by so many wounds each day. Here the Shakespearean metaphor is that of the ill health of a nation, and in this regard it's important that Malcolm has come to England. He has come to seek help from the English king, and that English king is not only seen as someone who can give Malcolm military help, but he is also seen as a healer. This idea is very important because it's associated with this line, the healer, the king who can really cure literally, Seward is such a king who can literally cure the diseases of the people in his kingdom. And therefore he's not just a ruler with secular powers of military powers and naval powers, but he's a deliverer along with being a ruler. And if you are a deliverer, then your position comes really very close to God. And Malcolm says that it is myself, in whom I know all the particulars of vice. And then Malcolm continues that it's really not Macbeth who is the villain, but I myself, whom you should consider as the villain, because I do have a number of vices. It's important to understand that here Shakespeare is heightening the constructed villainy of Malcolm, because Malcolm is not actually the villain here, but the constructed villainy of Malcolm only to emphasize and highlight the actual villainy of Macbeth. Macbeth is villainous, except that he hides his villainy. Malcolm is not villainous, but of course he highlights his villainy. So there is a distinction between highlighting and hiding. And Malcolm, he continues, I grant him bloody, luxurious, avaricious meaning greedy, false, deceitful, sudden, malicious, smacking of every sin that has a name, but there's no bottom, none in my voluptuousness. So Malcolm is saying that Macbeth may be all of these things, but compared to that is my voluptuousness, is my overwhelming greed and my overwhelming desire. Not only a desire for power, not only a desire for ambition, but a lust, almost a sexual desire, an illicit sexual desire to really make every one of the wives and the daughters of the kingdom and the maids an object to fulfill my lust. Here, of course, it's important that in this play the imagery, the sexual imagery is a very consistent one. There was a reference to fortune, almost like a whore, at the beginning of the play, where there was an image of rape and violation on the female self. And here, of course, this kind of a lust and illicit desire is something which continues. I refer to this previous image of the fortunes whore in Act 1, Scene 2. only to say that that image occurred when there was a rebellion against Duncan, and this whole conversation is really the seeds of a rebellion against Macbeth, and a similar kind of image is being used, and therefore we really understand what Shakespeare, the way in which Shakespearean imagery works. It works through the mode of recurrence, that is repetition not only to repeat the same idea, but repetition only to heighten and make clear that things which are repeated really are connected and are therefore to be remembered. But sadly and unfortunately, it's the people who have forgotten all of these things. And Macduff says, boundless intemperance in nature is a tyranny. It hath been the untimely emptying of the happy throne and fall of many kings. Here, of course, Macduff makes a very generalized statement about intemperance, about an unbalanced nature, which is the characteristic feature of a tyrant, and it has led to the fall of a number of kings. But fear not yet to take upon you what is yours. You may convey your pleasures in a spacious plenty and yet seem cold. And so Macduff says that he says to Malcolm that your voluptuousness, your greed, your lust is something which is so insignificant beside the immense greed and lust for power, for authority, which Macbeth presently is demonstrating. So we get an idea that Macduff really understands what Malcolm is up to, and therefore is trying to neutralize the constructed vice making that Malcolm is indulging in. And Malcolm continues, with this there grows in my most ill-composed affection such staunchless avarice. He's not going to give up that. And then he continues to say that were I a king, I would really be the most cruel and the most despotic of kings. I should cut off all the nobles for their lands and desire their jewels and others' houses, and really take more than what is mine and keep a lot of people in hunger. And I would, begin unjust quarrels against the good and the loyal. I remember something which even, ironically, it's really an instance of dramatic irony that, something which Macbeth himself had done. He had begun unjust quarrel against, for example, Banquo, who was good and loyal to him, only for power, only for ambition. This word wealth does not always literally mean money. It means something more than that. The power, the land, as well as the power associated with it, which comes within the framework of the word wealth. Macduff then says that this avarice sticks deeper, grows with the most pernicious root than summer seeming lust, and it had been the sword of our slain kings. Yet do not fear, Scotland hath poisons to fill up your will. Of your mere own, all these are potable, with other graces weighed. And so Macduff says that whatever is presently happening presently in Scotland is really much more poisonous than what Malcolm is stating. And Malcolm really, this statement that the king becoming grace is very important, that what are the characteristic features the king should have. It's important really to pause at this point and think, and Shakespeare is making this is long seen, a scene of much thought, that if we are calling Macbeth's position as illicit and illegal, because he really wasn't the son of Duncan, so he really had no right to sit on the throne of Scotland. It's also important that just because he wasn't born to be a king does not really make him incapable of being one. But of course there are a number of other characteristic features which make Macbeth not a good ruler. And how do we really understand what a good ruler is to really say that Macbeth is not good? We have only seen Macbeth's distorted thinking. We have only seen Macbeth's villainy. It's at this point, much later in the play, that Shakespeare highlights what a good king is, what an ideal king is, what are the characteristic features an ideal king should have. And these words, therefore, these adjectives, really very important to define what an ideal king is, because it's important when you all are writing a an answer on the irony of kingship. Irony is basically the difference between the ideal and the real. We have seen the reality of Macbeth. It's important, as a king, it's important to understand the ideality of what a king should be. Therefore, coming back to these very important adjectives: justice, a verity meaning truthfulness, temperance meaning a balanced nature, stableness means neutrality, bounty means generosity, perseverance means hard work, mercy, lowliness means a being humble, really caring for the people, devotion, patience, courage, fortitude is a strength of mind and character. All of these are really the ideal characteristic features of a king, except that Malcolm here says that he doesn't have any of them. In fact, he doesn't even like any of them. The word relish is liking, and he doesn't have liking for these. And it's basically he desires power, and to pour the sweet, and with that power he wishes only to bring about chaos and anarchy. The image of describing anarchy, very important: pour the sweet milk of concord into hell. Concord is a kind of union in opposition to whose opposite is the word discord or anarchy or chaos. Important because here Malcolm uses a similar kind of image like Lady Macbeth had used in the context of her husband. The milk of human kindness, which is too much, apparently was too much in Macbeth, and here really later we found that Macbeth really wasn't that kind, or kindness was something which he had been able to repress. Here again the image of the milk of kindness is only bringing about a milk of kindness, and concord and union is only being poured into hell to create complete uproar, complete anarchy, and complete chaos, to destroy peace and unity on earth. Macduff, after this, the way in which Malcolm is presenting himself, after this he begins to say that the words of Malcolm, even though enacted or uttered on the level of pretense and on the level of irony, are really taken at a face value by Macduff. It's important that in this play there are very few characters who understand the true nature of equivocation, because to be able to unravel the premises of the difference between appearance and reality, to actually understand the meaning of statements beyond their equivocating impulses, is really to understand the truth of existence itself, and very few characters are able to do that, and it is not really. And here I really would like to pause and state that it is really not in the capacity of characters, morally neutral characters like Banquo, like Macduff, to be able to do that unraveling. It is only after the characters have undergone the pains of the equivocating impulses that they are able to finally understand what the true nature of the statement actually lay in, or what it actually meant. Macduff says, fit to govern? No, not to live. So Malcolm, after revealing what his vices are, is really not even fit to govern, not even fit to live, O nation miserable with an untitled tyrant bloody sceptred. When shall thou see thy wholesome days again? And it was on the expectation of Malcolm that an expectation of wholesomeness, an expectation of peace and stability was expected on the part of Macduff, and he really feels that everything will become chaotic and anarchic again. The royal father of Malcolm, that is Duncan, was a most sainted king, and even the queen was a very good woman. But of course, goodness in Scotland is reaping evil of late, of which Malcolm really is a representation. Malcolm, Macduff, this noble fashioned child of integrity, hath from my soul wiped the black scruples. So, after playing with Macduff through equivocation, Malcolm finally reveals that this anger, this intimate passion, this shock, this surprise is something which finally makes him understand that Macduff is really not on the side of the tyrant, not really on the side of the vice-ridden person, and it has removed, Macduff's stance has really removed all seeds of curiosity on the part of Malcolm. Devilish Macbeth, by many of these strains, hath sought to win me into his power, and modest wisdom plucks me from over credulous haste. But God above, deal between me and thee and me, for even now I put myself in thy direction, and unspeak mine own detraction. So he says that he had deliberately exposed or represented or constructed his vice-ridden nature so that he would be able to test Macduff. So here lies in truth what we were throughout discussing, the testing scene of Macduff by Malcolm. And finally, after this testing is complete, he reveals that he has really come to he has come to England to seek the help of the England's king, who is not just a king but also a deliverer, old Seward, who has agreed already to help Malcolm with 10,000 warlike men who are already moving towards Scotland to invade the territory. And together they will act as agents of, very important word, goodness. Now, since Malcolm has finished testing Macduff, so they are both on one side, the clear side of the good against the clear opposite, the evil. Macduff, such welcome and unwelcome things at once, it is hard to reconcile. So even in this scene, there is still that dramatic irony working. There is still that difference between the ideal and the real. For example, when it had been told earlier that from where comfort seeks to, from the place where one expects comfort, discomfort swells. Again here, from where you expect welcome, unwelcome things come. In fact, now both things exist simultaneously, side by side, so it becomes very difficult to reconcile it. And then the doctor enters, this doctor who will represent to us the healing. Important here from this point onwards, because disease and healing will comprise one of the key set of images in Shakespeare's Macbeth. Before we had a reference to the ill health of the nation, now we will have the figure of the king as the healer. And here it is explained by Malcolm. It's called the evil, a most miraculous work in this good king, which often since here remain in England. I have seen him do how he solicits heaven. Himself knows best, but strangely visited people, all swollen and ulcerous, pitiful. So, people who are all swollen, people who have ulcers, people who have leprosy, go there, who are not cured through medical surgery, go to him, and he prays for these people and leaves really his royal power behind and looks towards a much more spiritual power of God, and the king bends himself before God, seeking benediction, seeking blessings. And it is through these blessings that these swollen and ulcerous people are finally cured, and Malcolm himself has been witness to such a thing. And here it is discussed and revealed to Macduff. And finally Ross comes and reveals to Macduff that the condition of Scotland, as well as the condition of his family. It's important here that Macduff is told that he is that he is all right, that he is well. Their immediate murder is not known to Ross and therefore not revealed to Macduff. This final this latter speech, Malcolm telling Ross, be it their comfort, we are coming thither. Gracious England had lent us good seaward, and then 1,000 men, an older and better soldier none than Christendom gives out. It's important that here the English king Seward is presented as a Christian king rather than a mere secular monarch, because it is with Christianity that his power of healing and his power of deliverance is associated. And if if Scotland has become so diseased, then really it is a healer who is required. And then after knowing the condition of after knowing what Malcolm has been able to gather, it is then that Ross reveals that the child and the wife of Macduff has been murdered. And it's important how Macduff really takes this action, this episode, how he reacts to this episode of grief. And he says, "Oh, I could play the woman with mine eyes and braggart with my tongue, but gentle heavens cut short all intermission front to front. Bring thou this field of Scotland and myself within my words, sword's length set him. If he escape, heaven forgive me." Macduff really does not spend a lot of words in expressing his grief and sorrow, which he says that it's womanly to be able to express grief and sorrow through words. He would rather stop all expression of grief through words and express it solely through action, through war. And this is really the difference between the poetic Macbeth and the extremely prosaic Macduff in their way of dealing with grief, in their way of dealing with grievance, which is to say again the potential which Macbeth has towards a tragic stature, this poetic unraveling, this power of consistent psychological introspection expressed through brilliant images, where he ponders deep into grief. For example, just after this, we will find in Act 5, Scene 1, where the report of Lady Macbeth's death will be given to her husband and the way in which he will react to it. It's important that we are able to compare and contrast this scene with that scene which will come up immediately in our next lecture. And however, for what is manly does not always is the substance of being poetic. And finally, Malcolm says, "This tune goes manly. Come, go we to the king. Our power is ready. Our lack is nothing but our leave. Macbeth is ripe for shaking." Here, of course, the very important plant imagery or the tree imagery associated with Macbeth. He's become almost like a ripe fruit, which is good enough now for shaking, and it will only after this time fall, perish and decay. He will die. And therefore it's important that on the one hand there's the use of nature imagery to describe or to explain the destruction of a character. It is at the same time there is use of nature imagery to talk about the hailing of a new day. For example, the night is long and there will be no night can be that long which doesn't end in the beginning through a new day. So nature imagery, very importantly in Shakespeare, in Macbeth and in most of his plays, are used to describe very divergent purposes. And And in this scene, therefore, it's important to keep these in mind. But finally, to keep in mind the highlights really of this scene, through which are the images of disease and the images of relation, the relativity between foil characters. Thank you.